It all started on a sweltering summer afternoon, the kind where the sun bakes the dirt into hard, cracked patterns, and the air shimmers with heat waves rising from the earth. My ranch, sprawling over 1,300 acres of rolling grasslands, sparse, groves of oak, and a meandering creek, had been in my family for generations. The ranch was my sanctuary, my pride, and the place where I could live life on my terms. Far away from the suffocating rules of homeowners associations that seemed obsessed with every minor detail in people's lives, I had moved to this property years ago, leaving behind a small-town lifestyle that felt constricting and heading into the wide, open expanse of land that was mine to steward. I worked hard to make the ranch not only a livable space but a thriving one, with cattle grazing in controlled paddocks, orchards meticulously maintained, and a workshop where I repaired machinery or built fences whenever the mood struck me. The peaceful rhythm of ranch life was interrupted one day by what I quickly learned was a problem that even acres of freedom couldn't shield me from. Karen, my local HOA president, the woman whose name seemed to be synonymous with petty power. Trips had decided she had the right to assert authority over my property. Karen was the type of person who always thought the rules applied to everyone but her. The one who would meticulously measure fence heights in neighboring yards and threaten stored fines for the smallest perceived infractions. She had recently discovered that my property technically fell within a small HOA jurisdiction. Even though the boundaries were murky and my deed predated the formation of the HOA, that didn't stop her from thinking she could dictate my life. That morning, she had called me out of the blue, her voice shrill and condescending, as she insisted I allow her son to use part of my ranch for recreational purposes. I listened, patient but firm, explaining that my land was not for public use and that trespassing was not permitted. Karen, of course, was undeterred. She had that unnerving combination of entitlement and irritation, the kind that made people feel guilty for existing in their own homes the way they wanted to. The conversation ended with her threat. If I didn't comply, she would call the authorities. I had laughed at her, telling her she could try, but she had hung up on me, muttering something about making sure her son got what he wanted. Little did she know this was not a battle she was prepared for. Hours later, as I was inspecting the western pasture, where I had recently installed new fencing, my phone rang. The screen flashed her name. I knew instantly what this meant. Karen was on the line, her voice practically vibrating with indignation. "I've called 911, she declared before I could say a word. "You need to leave your ranch immediately. My son needs access, and you're standing in the way." I paused, trying not to laugh outright. The sheer absurdity of it was remarkable. I let her finish, listing off imagined violations, imagined rules, and imagined consequences, all delivered in a breathless tone that suggested she expected the sheriff and state police to magically materialize at her command. The longer she spoke, the more absurd it became, until she finally stopped to breathe. I took the opportunity to respond calmly, letting her know, in my most neutral tone, that the ranch was my private property and that trespassing was not allowed. Her shrillness escalated immediately. "I don't care who you think you are. My son has rights. You're breaking the law by keeping him out," she screeched. At that moment, I realized she truly believed her authority extended across my 1,300 acres. I decided it was time to reveal a little fact she hadn't anticipated. "Karen," I said slowly, my tone deliberate and controlled, "I'm the sheriff of this county." There was a pause on the line. A long, confused pause, broken only by the faint rustle of paper, and what I imagined was her frantic consulting of HOA bylaws. Her voice dropped an octave as she asked, "Wait, what?" "Yes," I said. "I'm the sheriff, and this is my property. You have no authority here. If you try to involve 911 to harass me again, that's considered false reporting." "Why?" Silence on the other end was electric. I could practically hear her heartbeat through the line, the mental gears grinding as she tried to reconcile the image of herself as a powerful HOA leader with the reality that I had the badge. And, most importantly, the legal right to be wherever I pleased on my own land. The entire conversation could have ended there, but Karen. in her infinite determination to escalate things unnecessarily, decided to push further. She demanded to speak with another officer, some imagined higher authority, and I explained patiently, but firmly, that there was no higher authority on this matter, at least not in her favor. I could hear her sputtering, grasping for words, trying to maintain the illusion that she had any control. And in that moment, I realized something essential. Karen was not just a thorn in my side. She was a hurricane, a force of entitlement, so blind that it demanded a confrontation. Later that day, as I walked the perimeter of the ranch, I reflected on the situation. Being sheriff in addition to being a ranch owner gave me a unique perspective. I had faced disputes before, usually involving trespassing, disputes over livestock, or minor property disagreements. But this situation was different. Karen wasn't simply asking to use my property. She was weaponizing bureaucracy, trying to manipulate systems of authority she didn't understand, all because she assumed her HOA status made her untouchable. I decided to take a strategic approach. I documented every interaction, every phone call, every threat she had made. I reviewed the property lines, the deeds, and the bylaws, ensuring there was no loophole she could exploit. I even spoke with my deputies, not because I needed protection, but to make sure the legal position was airtight should she escalate further. As evening fell, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple over the hills, I saw movement near the entrance of the ranch. It was Karen's car, parked conspicuously on the edge of my property. Her audacity was astounding. I walked up to the fence line, my boots crunching on dry grass, and called out to her. "You're on private property," I said. "I suggest you leave." Her face turned pale, the confident smirk replaced by disbelief. She stammered, claiming she was just checking boundaries, a statement so transparently false that I couldn't help but chuckle. I explained again that this was my property and that she had no right to be there. Slowly, she backed toward her car, muttering under her breath, a string of complaints that sounded more like curses than coherent sentences. That night, as I locked the gates and secured the ranch, I felt a mix of amusement and satisfaction. Karen had learned in the most direct way possible that not all authority is created equal. Ownership and legal right, backed by the power of the office I held, trumped her HOA fantasies. Yet I knew this was only the beginning. Karen's pride and stubbornness were formidable, and I had a sense she would try to retaliate in ways that were both petty and absurd. I reviewed security camera footage, checked motion sensors, and even made sure my deputies were briefed to keep an eye on any potential misuse of the 911 system. This wasn't just about property, it was about principle. Karen believed the rules didn't apply to her. I believed that actions have consequences, and on my ranch, the consequences were clear. By the time the moon rose over the hills, casting silver light across the creek and grazing fields, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, reflecting on how fragile the illusion of control can be for people like. When she had assumed she could bend reality with a phone call, she had assumed I would cower or be intimidated. She had assumed wrong. The night was quiet except for the occasional call of an owl or the rustle of a deer moving through the brush. But in that stillness, I could feel a storm brewing, not one of nature, but one of inevitability. Karen's next move was uncertain, but one thing was certain. She had no idea who she was dealing with, and the sheriff of this county was not a woman to be pushed around, no matter how loud her threats or how important her son imagined himself to be. The morning after our heated phone exchange, I woke to the familiar smell of sun-baked earth and fresh coffee brewing in my kitchen. The ranch had settled into its usual rhythm, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whinny of horses, and the occasional crow of a rooster, but there was an undercurrent of tension that had been there before. Karen's audacity the previous day had rattled her, and I knew instinctively that her next move would be even more absurd, more desperate. The question was, how would she try to force her way onto my land? As sheriff, I was well aware of the spectrum of human behavior under the illusion of power. I had seen everything from petty vandalism to well-planned schemes designed to intimidate. But Karen, in her unique combination of entitlement and myopic obsession with rules that didn't apply to her, was a different challenge. I made a mental note to double-check every access point on the ranch. My perimeter fences were solid, reinforced by steel posts and wooden rails, but Karen had a knack for finding loopholes, for imagining ways to bend reality in her favor. Around mid-morning, as I was walking the northern boundary where the creek formed a natural barrier, my radio crackled with a report from Deputy Jenkins. "Sheriff, you might want to check the eastern gate," he said, his voice calm but tinged with that subtle note of urgency that indicated something unusual. I drove down in my truck, windows down, feeling the dry wind whip against my face. Sure enough, there was Karen's car, parked just outside the gate, engine running, as if she were ready to storm the property at any moment. I stepped out of the truck and called her name. She froze, caught mid-motion, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong, which of course she was. "Karen," I said evenly, walking toward her, "you're on private property again. I suggest you leave before this escalates further." She opened her mouth, clearly preparing to argue, but her eyes betrayed her panic. That split second of realization, that flicker of uncertainty, was priceless. She was not used to people confronting her with authority she could not challenge. The words were hollow, and I could see through them immediately. "You've been told repeatedly," I said, "that this is private property. Your persistence is considered trespassing, and as the sheriff, I can take action if necessary." Her lips pressed together, a small tremor betraying her frustration. Slowly she started to back away, hands raised as if surrendering. I kept my gaze steady, knowing that my calm demeanor was doing more to assert control than any threat ever could. By noon I was back at the main house, sipping water and surveying the ranch from the porch. Karen hadn't given up. I knew she was probably plotting, trying to convince herself that there was some technicality, some loophole, some way to bend reality to her will. But she hadn't accounted for one crucial detail. I wasn't just any rancher, and I wasn't just any property owner. I was the sheriff. My authority was real, enforceable, and backed by law. By early afternoon, I saw movement again, this time near the creek that formed a natural southern boundary. It wasn't Karen, but a small group of her friends, armed with clipboards, cameras, and measuring tapes, presumably documenting everything to prove my alleged violations of HOA regulations. It was comical if it weren't so infuriating. I walked down the hill toward them, boots crunching on the dry earth, and called out, "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I assume you've been authorized to be here by me. Otherwise, this is private property and you're trespassing." They froze, blinking in disbelief. One of them muttered something about HOA rules, zoning codes, and the need to measure setbacks. I raised an eyebrow. "None of that applies to me here. This property predates your association. You're not authorized. Please leave immediately." Slowly they retreated, whispering to one another, clearly debating whether to argue further or retreat. That night, I made sure every gate was locked, cameras checked, and motion sensors fully operational. I even set up a temporary range of floodlights along the main entrances. If Karen or her entourage tried anything under the cover of darkness, I wanted them to know that their audacity would not go unnoticed. The next morning, as the first hints of sunlight touched the rolling hills, a new development occurred. Karen called again this time, much earlier, her voice trembling with an unusual urgency. "Sheriff, I need to talk to you. It's about my son. He really needs access." I let her ramble, pretending to listen intently, though I already knew the script. It was the same pattern: entitlement, assumed authority, and desperate pleading. I finally cut in, calm and deliberate. "Karen, your son has no legal right to access this property. If your goal is to escalate this, you're wasting your time. I will not tolerate harassment, trespassing, or false claims to law enforcement." There was a long pause, and then a squeak of disbelief in her voice. Wait, you're serious? You really are the sheriff?" I let the silence hang just long enough for her to stew in the revelation. "Yes," I said finally. I'm the sheriff, and this is my property. Any further attempts to manipulate the system or claim access for your son will be considered harassment and treated accordingly." She hung up abruptly, probably to hide her embarrassment, or perhaps to consult some imagined authority figure in her mind. That day I focused on the operational side of the ranch. I checked water levels in the creek, inspected the fences, and oversaw the feeding of cattle, all while keeping one eye on the access roads for any unusual movement. Karen's response, or lack thereof, was telling. She hadn't tried to show up physically, at least not yet. Perhaps the realization that I could personally authorize any intervention had finally dawned on her. Or maybe she was plotting her next move, desperate to find some way to circumvent reality. By mid-afternoon, my intuition was confirmed. Deputies called in to report suspicious vehicles circling the perimeter of the ranch. It was subtle, more observation than trespassing, but it indicated a level of persistence that bordered on obsession. Karen was not willing to back down simply because of logic or authority. She was driven by pride, entitlement, and an unwavering belief in her imagined rights. That evening, as the sky turned deep orange and then dusky purple, I sat on the porch once more, surveying the land, reflected on the nature of power, entitlement, and human behavior. Karen's actions were a textbook example of what happens when people assume authority without understanding its limits. She believed that HOA status and parental influence granted her absolute control. In reality, authority backed by law, experience, and physical presence had the final word. And yet I also recognized the delicate balance required. I didn't want unnecessary confrontation, but I couldn't allow intimidation or trespassing. The solution required strategic thinking, patience, and clear boundaries. Over the next few days, Karen attempted various maneuvers. She sent letters, emails, and even a formal complaint to the HOA, claiming harassment, restriction of access, and other fabricated grievances. Each time, I responded calmly and professionally, citing legal authority, property deeds, and precedents that nullified her claims. Internally, I prepared for the possibility of an in-person confrontation, ensuring deputies were aware of potential escalation without actively involving them unless absolutely necessary. One afternoon, as I was checking irrigation systems along the eastern pasture, a car approached slowly from the main road. The driver, of course, was Karen, accompanied by her teenage son, who looked utterly bewildered by the situation. Karen stopped the vehicle at the gate, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes wild with a combination of fear, anger, and defiance. I walked toward them, maintaining a calm, authoritative stance. "Karen," I said evenly, "you've been instructed repeatedly. This is private property. You may not enter. As your son may not enter. If you attempt to proceed, that will be considered trespassing." She started to protest. But the moment she noticed my uniform glinting in the sunlight and the badge pinned to my chest, her argument faltered. Her son, glancing between me and his mother, seemed to understand for the first time that this wasn't a game. I could see the dawning realization in his eyes. This was reality, and it had rules that could not be bent with entitlement or shrill demands. Karen finally muttered something about needing access for his experience and turned the car around, leaving the ranch in silence. Her son subdued, her authority completely undermined by the stark reality of law and property rights. That night I reflected on the events. Confrontation had not required force, threats, or escalation. My calm enforcement of authority, strategic planning, and clear communication had been sufficient to reassert control. Karen's repeated attempts to manipulate the system, once rooted in ignorance and arrogance, had been met with a response grounded in law, experience, and patience. By the time the stars appeared, sparkling over the ranch like scattered diamonds across the sky, the tension had eased. Karen had temporarily retreated, likely licking her wounds and reconsidering her next move. For me, the victory was quiet but profound. The ranch remained mine, the cattle grazed peacefully, and the creek sparkled in the moonlight. Karen had learned through repeated but non-violent confrontation that power has limits, that law trumps entitlement, and that the sheriff of this county would not be coerced by shrill demands, personal connections, or imagined authority. I sipped my coffee once more, the cool night air brushing against my face, and realized that this was more than a victory over Karen. It was a reaffirmation of the principles I lived by: patience, justice, and the unwavering defense of what was rightfully mine. And while I knew Karen would never entirely give up, for now at least, peace had returned to the ranch. And the law had prevailed without a single shot fired or a single gate forcibly closed. The calm that had settled over the ranch after Karen's last failed attempt was deceptive. I knew better than to assume she would simply accept defeat. Karen was the type of person who didn't just give up when faced with authority. She recalibrated, looking for another angle, a loophole, some way to manipulate the system in her favor. Over the next week, I noticed subtle signs of escalation. Her cars circling the property at odd hours, emails with increasingly desperate demands, and most telling strange packages appearing near the property line, things that suggested she was trying to surveil or influence activities without actually setting foot on my land. I walked the ranch daily, inspecting fences, gates, and the creek that bisected the property, always alert to unusual activity. Deputies made routine checks, but I handled most of the observation myself. It wasn't just a matter of security, it was a matter of principle. Karen's obsession with control had begun to border on harassment, and I knew she might try to exploit even the smallest opportunity. One afternoon, while checking irrigation pumps in the western orchard, I spotted something unusual near the main road. A small drone hovered low, seemingly capturing footage of the ranch. My suspicions were immediately confirmed. Karen was escalating, using technology to bypass the obvious barriers of fences and gates. I retrieved a long-range signal jammer from the workshop, a precaution I had prepared months ago for exactly this type of intrusion, and deactivated the drone safely. The operator, who I later confirmed through the video feed, was none other than Karen herself. Likely had no idea I was watching in real time. That evening she called again, voice strained with frustration and desperation. "Sheriff, I don't understand. I just wanted my son to," she began, then faltered as I cut her off. "Karen, let me make this perfectly clear. Your son has no right to enter my property. You have no right to surveil or interfere with activities here. Any further attempts, whether physical, technological, or through third parties, will be treated as harassment under state law. Is that understood?" She stammered, her composure completely gone. Yes. I understand," she muttered, though I knew from experience that she would try again in some new way. The very next morning, I discovered her next scheme. One of my deputies reported a group of surveyors supposedly authorized by the HOA entering a public road adjacent to my property, measuring and photographing the fence line. I walked over to the site, identifying the individuals, and calmly asked for proof of authorization. Naturally, they had none that was legally binding. I instructed them to leave, informing them that trespassing or any attempt to manipulate boundaries would be considered a criminal offense. As I watched them drive away, I realized that Karen's obsession had now expanded into a small army of proxies, each attempting in vain to bend reality to her whims. Over the following days, I began implementing more proactive measures. Security cameras were repositioned, floodlights tested, and all access roads were inspected multiple times daily. I also notified my deputies to keep an eye on any unusual activity within a mile of the property. I wasn't looking for confrontation, but I wanted to ensure that Karen had no chance to escalate without consequence. She eventually realized that legal intimidation would not work, so she pivoted to social manipulation. Flyers appeared in nearby towns, depicting me as a tyrant rancher denying access to children and violating HOA regulations. Social media posts appeared, riddled with half-truths and outright fabrications. I chose to respond not with anger, but with calm, professional statements, citations of property law, explanations of legal authority, and reminders that harassment or false reporting could result in criminal liability. Her attempts at character assassination were ineffective. Most locals already knew me as the sheriff, and her stories fell flat against the weight of reality. One particularly tense afternoon, I encountered Karen in person again at the local general store. She was speaking loudly, pointing to her phone, and attempting to draw a small crowd into her narrative. I approached calmly, deputies just out of sight, and addressed her in a measured tone. "Karen, you've made your position clear, and I've made mine clear. I have no authority over my property, and your repeated harassment is noted. Please leave." Her mouth opened to protest, but the crowd seemed uncertain. Many of them knew me personally, and the badge I wore carried authority that could not be ignored. Flustered, she muttered something about HOA rights and fled the store in a huff, leaving her son behind momentarily, who looked embarrassed and bewildered. Back at the ranch, I reflected on the nature of her escalation. Karen had moved from direct confrontation to surveillance, third-party proxies, social manipulation, and public shaming. Each step was a testament to her obsession and unwillingness to acknowledge legal boundaries. Yet in every scenario, my calm enforcement of law and property rights kept her in check. I decided it was time to take a more creative, preemptive approach. I didn't want confrontation, but I wanted to ensure she could not attempt anything without immediate consequence. Over the next week, I made minor adjustments to the ranch infrastructure, subtle barriers along public road access points, discreet signage reminding that the land was private, and repositioned floodlights that activated automatically when motion was detected near entrances. I also worked with deputies to monitor unusual vehicles and patterns of behavior from a distance, ensuring that Karen could not approach without detection. One morning, as I was inspecting the Southern Creek bank, I noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the property. My pulse quickened, slightly not out of fear, but in anticipation. I followed the tracks discreetly and saw a small group attempting to drive across a shallow part of the creek, apparently hoping to access the ranch undetected. I stepped into view, hand on my belt, and identified myself clearly. "You are on private property," I said. "Turn around immediately or face trespassing charges." Recognition dawned on their faces, and they hastily retreated. I noted the license plates and later confirmed that Karen had orchestrated this attempt. It was a clear escalation, a physical test of boundaries designed to push limits. That evening, I called a team meeting with my deputies. We reviewed the incidents, reinforced patrol schedules, and discussed additional measures for preventing unauthorized access. I emphasized de-escalation but also underscored that any attempt at trespassing or harassment would be met with immediate legal action. Karen's obsession, while infuriating, was predictable. I could anticipate her moves and respond accordingly, minimizing risk to myself, the property, and my staff. By the next week, I had implemented a final layer of strategic deterrence: visible security cameras at all major access points, motion-activated floodlights, and a subtle network of sensors along vulnerable areas. It was a system designed to be non-confrontational, but utterly effective in detecting and recording any intrusion. I wanted Karen to know that while I preferred calm enforcement, there was no gap she could exploit. Then came the most telling escalation yet. One morning, I arrived at the ranch to find a small tent pitched near the western boundary, clearly meant as an encampment for observers. Inside the tent were supplies, cameras, and logs, indicating they had been monitoring ranch activities for several nights. I called the local deputies, who confirmed that all individuals were connected to Karen's HOA network. Calmly, I approached, announcing myself as sheriff and property owner. "This is private property," I said. "You must vacate immediately. Any refusal will be considered trespassing." The individuals hesitated, clearly expecting resistance or argument. I maintained a neutral, authoritative stance, and after a tense few moments, they began packing. As they left, I documented everything, noting Karen's role in orchestrating the surveillance. By this point, Karen had escalated through almost every conceivable avenue short of violence. She had attempted direct confrontation, drone surveillance, proxies, social manipulation, and encampments, unsuccessful because I had anticipated, documented, and addressed each move. That evening, I sat on the porch, the ranch bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Karen's obsession had revealed her own limitations. She could manipulate perception, attempt intimidation, and exploit ignorance, but she could not bend law, authority, or reality. The victory wasn't just about property, it was about principle. By asserting authority calmly, strategically, and consistently, I had ensured that the ranch remained mine, undisturbed by external manipulation. Karen, on the other hand, had been repeatedly reminded that entitlement has limits, and that the sheriff of this county was not someone to be trifled with. As the stars emerged over the hills, I reflected on the nature of power, persistence, and the importance of preparation. Karen had been relentless, but so had I in planning, in enforcement, and in maintaining boundaries. The ranch was secure, the cattle grazed peacefully, the creek shimmered in the moonlight, a silent testament to the resilience of law, order, and calm authority in the face of unrelenting absurdity. And while I knew Karen would continue to plot for now, her escalation had been contained. Her strategies thwarted, and her attempts to assert imaginary authority rendered completely ineffective. The following week brought an eerie calm over the ranch. Karen's flurry of escalating attempts, drones, proxies, encampments, public shaming campaigns had all been neutralized, and the property felt like it finally belonged to me again. Yet I knew better than to assume that calm would last forever. Karen had pride, stubbornness, and an ego invested in proving herself right, and such people rarely disappear quietly. I had already anticipated the psychological warfare she might attempt next. Passive-aggressive communications, indirect confrontations, and perhaps attempts to bend neighbors or local officials into siding with her. Early one morning, as the ranch awakened to the soft calls of birds and the lowing of cattle, I received an unusual message. It wasn't a phone call, email, or HOA. Notice it was a hand-delivered letter left at the gate, its envelope thick, crisp, and overly formal. Opening it, I found a statement from Karen's lawyer, claiming that her son had legal rights to access the property, and that my enforcement of trespassing rules constituted harassment and obstruction of parental rights. I read it carefully, noting the lack of any legitimate legal basis, the misrepresentation of laws, and the audacity of submitting such a document. Smiling faintly, I filed it away in the ranch's legal records. I knew this was the final stage of Karen's escalation, the legal bluff. It was clear she hoped that by invoking the language of law, regardless of accuracy, she could intimidate me or sway public opinion. I called my deputy in to review the claims, and we laughed over the absurdity before drafting a calm, professional rebuttal citing deeds, property law, and the fact that parental rights do not extend to trespassing on private land. That afternoon, I decided it was time to put an end to this saga once and for all. I began with a visible reinforcement of the ranch's boundaries, new gates, clearly marked private property signs, and subtle surveillance equipment that not only recorded intrusions, but served as a deterrent to future attempts. It wasn't aggressive, it was strategic. The goal wasn't confrontation. It was to make any further escalation by Karen futile. A few days later, the climax arrived. I was checking fences along the northern pasture when I spotted a familiar car approaching. Karen, predictably, had returned, her face a mask of determination and desperation. This time, she was alone, but she carried with her a box of what appeared to be documents, maps, and more evidence of her imagined claims. I watched her pull up to the gate, parked haphazardly as if ready to charge the property at any moment. I took a deep breath, approaching with my usual calm, hands visible, badge gleaming in the sunlight. "Karen," I said evenly, "you are trespassing. Leave immediately. Any attempt to enter this property will result in arrest." She froze, eyes darting between me, the gate, and the expanse of ranch that stretched beyond. "Sheriff, I need to show you this. My son." I held up a hand. "Karen, your claims have no legal basis. Repeated attempts to assert authority over this property have been documented, countered, and neutralized. Leave or you will be taken into custody." For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Not the faint panic of surprise, but the full weight of understanding that she had miscalculated, that her obsession had blinded her to reality. She faltered, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling. Slowly, she began to retreat, toward her car, glancing back nervously. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'll get you for this." I said nothing, watching her drive away. The calm of the ranch returned immediately, almost tangibly, as if her presence alone had been a cloud that had now lifted. Over the following days, Karen made no further attempts to approach the property. I've maintained security patrols and checks, of course, but there were no drones, no proxies, no encampments. Even the letters ceased. It became clear that the realization of futility had finally dawned on her. She had expended every imaginable tactic and failed repeatedly against the steadfast enforcement of law, property rights, and calm authority. As the weeks passed, the ranch settled into a rhythm of peace and productivity. I focused on cattle rotations, irrigation schedules, and minor maintenance, reflecting often on the events that had unfolded. Karen's obsession, relentless as it had been, became a case study in entitlement, escalation, and the limits of imagined authority. I took satisfaction in the fact that the conflict had been resolved without physical confrontation, without violence, relying instead on preparation, knowledge, and strategic enforcement. I also realized how fortunate I was to have been both ranch owner and sheriff, in alignment of authority and property rights that allowed me to neutralize an otherwise persistent threat. By late summer, Karen had largely disappeared from the local scene. Rumors circulated that she was appealing HOA rules or consulting lawyers, but these were distant echoes, incapable of affecting the reality on the ranch. Her son, who had been central to her claims, had become quiet and withdrawn, perhaps sensing the futility of their campaign. Occasionally I would see them from a distance, driving past on the main road, eyes averted. The shadow of past humiliation evident. Life on the ranch returned to its natural rhythm. Cattle grazing under wide blue skies, creek waters sparkling in sunlight, orchards yielding their seasonal bounty. I took long rides through the hills, feeling the weight of responsibility and the joy of ownership. In moments of reflection, I understood that the saga with Karen was not merely about property disputes. It was about the assertion of reality over illusion, of law over entitlement, of patience and calm over rash escalation. One crisp morning, as I walked along the creek that curved gracefully through the property, I noticed fresh tracks leading away from the gate. Instinctively, I checked the security cameras, expecting perhaps some minor attempt at trespassing or observation. To my surprise, the tracks led to the edge of the property where Karen had parked countless times, but there was no evidence of intrusion. Instead, the prints indicated a hesitant approach, almost reverent, as if whoever had made them was testing boundaries from a distance. I smiled quietly, knowing that the lesson had been learned. Authority, preparation, calm enforcement had not only preserved the ranch, but had imparted an unspoken truth to those who had sought to challenge it. That there are limits to entitlement and consequences to persistence when faced with reality. The final confrontation had been more psychological than physical. Karen's understanding of law, authority, and property rights had been irreversibly challenged. The pattern of escalation had been broken, and the ranch, my sanctuary, had been reaffirmed as a space of order, peace, and freedom. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the rolling hills and glinting off the creek, I stood on the porch reflecting on the journey. Karen's obsession had been a trial, but it had also been an opportunity to demonstrate the power of calm, knowledge, and authority. Every step she took to manipulate, intimidate, or coerce had been met with preparation, patience, and a steadfast commitment to principle. By the time darkness settled over the ranch, with stars twinkling in a clear sky, the message was clear. Karen's attempts were futile, her authority imagined, and the sheriff's and the ranch owner's power absolute within these boundaries. The property, the cattle, the creek, and the orchards remained undisturbed, a testament to the unwavering defense of law, ownership, and reason. In the end, Karen had retreated, her energy spent, her plans foiled, and her understanding of limits irrevocably expanded. Peace returned to the ranch in full, a calm that was deeper and more satisfying than any victory gained through confrontation or force. The lesson was indelible. Persistence and obsession without legal or practical basis meet inevitable consequences. An authority grounded in knowledge, preparation, and patience always prevails. The ranch, as it had been for generations, remained mine, a sanctuary of law, order, and freedom, untouched by entitlement, protected by vigilance, and imbued with the quiet triumph of calm, unwavering authority.